Anyways, okay, let's get into the meat and the potatoes of this. And if you're vegan, I do apologize, but you should probably get into the meat of this one. The potatoes are great, but they've got a lot of starch. So, and starch is not good. It will make you fat like me. And then you will have to do a lot of working out in order to get rid of that one little minuscule potato. Or, as they said on Rings of Power, if you're into bad television, uh, give me the meat and give it to me raw. That was an actual line from the Rings of Power, and they thought I don't know how it got beyond just the script writer's room or something, but that is bad television. That is a bad way of saying it. Please. And if you like bad TV, you should watch The Rings of Power on Amazon. It is truly a train wreck, just like most of my live streams will probably be. I just hope to be a little bit better than them as we go. So here we are. Tips and tricks of why your drop-in system probably sucks and how you can get the most out of it. So for one, probably the first thing that you need to do, and this is something that I learned the hard way by building trigger systems, is you need to oil the trigger. You need to oil at the very least or lubricate the connector. What's up, Scott? I see you're here. It's good to have you here. You're listening. If you have any input, keep it to yourself, Scott. Keep it to yourself. So oil or lubricate your connector. That is the first thing that you need to do. There is a misconception that Glocks need to be dry or that they can be run dry. That is not true. You need to oil your Glock. You need to lubricate your Glock. In the directions or instructions, the manual, it shows the oiling points for a Glock. If you have any questions, get with me and I'll show you where those are. But the number one place that you need to lubricate for an optimal trigger system, for an optimal trigger system, is the connector. Where the trigger bar rides on the connector, that area right there, you need to oil that. You need to lubricate that, because that's where the main amount of friction is. And that is going to change the way the trigger feels. And it's going to keep you from having trigger issues right out of the box. People get excited. They buy a drop-in trigger system. They're like, hey, I got my trigger. I'm going to drop it in. I'm going to do some dry firing and see how it feels. And then it gets really heavy very quickly. And they think that trigger that they bought is faulty. Truth is, they made a mistake. They got excited. And you've ruined the connector. Ask me how I know this. I ran into this from the very beginning by sending out triggers, my triggers, without putting any sort of lubricant on the connector, and I was having a lot of connector failures. And it turned out when I dug into it, people were just getting excited and they were dropping these triggers in without lubricating them. So all of my triggers that I send out now have my special personal, well, that sounds a little meat and potato, or give it to me raw meat, has the lubricant that I prefer, which is badger snot. Stuff works. So if you see a green glob of ick on the back of the trigger when you order it from me, that's what it is. Leave it on there. It works really well. You can buy more. It is a great gun lubricant. It is a great trigger lubricant. So that is the first thing to making your drop-in not suck and lasting longer. Lubricate it. Use badger snot. It's available on the website, or use whatever works for you. If it's Crisco, if it's hops gun oil, use that. use it, but lubricate your trigger component. There's oil. Greases work a little bit better. They're a bit smoother when it comes to trigger activation. So that is step one for making your drop-in not suck. The next one that we've got is, and this is the second major step. And honestly, it is probably the major step, because you should know to lubricate your gun. But again, there's a myth out there that you can run a Glock dry. Don't do it. So the next one, get yourself a Glock armorer's plate. Again, they're on the website. You can get a custom one with my logo on it, and that would be awesome because it's aluminum, it looks good, and it's going to last you for a very long time. But if not, get a plastic one. They're available for like $5, or you can take one of your old factory ones and just cut the bottom of it off so that you can see, and I have a video on this, the cruciform to striker lug engagement, because most likely you don't have the optimum setup. It probably works. It may even feel better than factory, but if you want to tune this thing and make it as good as possible, if you want to make your investment, what are the words I'm looking for? Do forgive me. If you want to make your investment as best as possible, you want to get the most for your money, because let's be honest, your money is not as free flowing as it was just a few years ago. You need to tune this thing. So take the Glock armorer's plate, put it on the back of your slide, check that striker lug to cruciform engagement. If you have too much, that trigger is going to drag, and it's going to be heavier, and it's going to have more of a rolling break, and it's going to feel like crap, especially if it's over 100% striker lug to cruciform engagement. It's going to make a good trigger feel like crap. And you're going to wonder why you spent that $100+ on a drop-in trigger that feels worse than your factory one or the one you had previously. So, striker lug engagement. What are the parameters for that? Glock specifies, and in my video, I made a mistake. I said 80 to 100% is Glock specifications. It's actually 2/3 to 100%, which is 66%. So, less striker lug engagement is going to have a crisper, lighter break than more engagement. So, just like tuning a race car or tuning something for performance, you run an edge. You run along the edge. If you want the best, if you're going to carry that thing, go 100% striker lug engagement. And this is honestly not something that I had planned on getting into. So maybe this part of the video will not go to be saved. We'll see. But 66%, that is the base for what Glock considers safe. So at 66%, you're still considered safe. Some triggers that might be, that might be considered running along the edge. So if you're considering carrying that, maybe run closer to 100%. But that is the next part of tuning your trigger, your drop-in or your performance trigger to the max. And you want to get the best, cleanest break, you need to look at that striker lug engagement. Drop it down to where you feel. And that's the thing. Feel. If you feel like, and you modify that engagement, and I have the video, like I said, watch the video on how to do it, because you can break your trigger bar. If you have 110% and you modify that and you get it down to 80% and that trigger feels awesome, leave it. Don't go any lighter than that. Don't go any less than that. It's about tuning. It's about what you feel. Make that trigger finger happy, but don't make it too light. Less is going to be crisper. More is going to be more of a rolling break or a little bit of a drag. It's going to make a trigger feel heavier than it is. So that's number 2. Get your Glock armor's plate, adjust that cruciform, but don't go too light. Don't go too little, because for a couple different reasons. One, if you have too little striker lug engagement to your cruciform, you run the risk of, you're out of spec, which means you're unsafe, because when that trigger goes to reset, that trigger bar pops back into place, and that slight moment when you release that trigger to reset, that trigger bar drops very slightly before engaging again. Now, if you do not have enough striker lug engagement, that little bit of drop is going to be enough to drop the striker forward, and then you will have a binary trigger, and you won't have to spend a lot of money on a binary trigger because you've just made your trigger binary. So it's probably something I shouldn't have told you, but that's what it is. Okay. I mean, that's one way to do it. So striker lug engagement, tune it. That's number 2. That's one of the probably the most important ones. And if I was trying to string you along and get you to watch more of this rambling live stream, I would have told you that one last. So that's the big one. That's the secret. Okay. Next one up is on the vertical extension. Some people call it the bird's beak. It's the one that rides on the safety plunger that sits in the slide. You got the safety plunger. That right there, a lighter weight spring in that safety plunger is going to reduce trigger weight. As you pull it back, it's going to, because, and depending on the trigger system, some of them are going to be shaped a little bit different. As you're pulling that trigger back, it's going to engage with that safety plunger, and it's riding on that safety plunger, pushing that safety plunger up. With a lighter weight spring, obviously you're going to have less pressure. The next thing is a rounded safety plunger, especially in generation 3, generation 4. Generation 5 is not so much, because they went to a different system, which is one of the reasons why it has a bit of a crisper feel versus generation 3. That is going to give you a rolling sensation. It's going to increase resistance as you get back to the wall. That's why you're going to feel why a good tuned trigger system will have more of a crisp wall. Come on, you can get me, camera. Why it's going to have more of a crisp wall break versus just most of your drop-ins. Think about that. So by changing to a rounded safety plunger, also with a reduced weight spring, you are going to reduce the amount of drag that you have on the trigger bar. Now you can say, well, this is just a very simple thing, and when you're even just throwing parts at it, you're probably going to buy that stuff anyways. Yes, but when we're talking about tuning and changing things, little bits, and the way that you tune that trigger, you can not change this and just change that and get a trigger to be tuned to where you want it, different weights wise. So let's say you skip the safety plunger and leave the safety plunger so that you still get that rolling break, because that's what you want. Well, then you leave that alone. But this is just one part of the system. So the next thing that you need to look at with the safety plunger is, and this is a little bit harder to see, but if you have the Glock armor's plate, you will be able to see up inside there. And also, depending on the slide that you have, some slides are going to sit lower to the frame, which means you're going to get more engagement. It's going to push on that safety plunger sooner and harder, and possibly even be scraping the slide itself. So take your slide apart, look at right in front of the plunger, see if your trigger bar has actually been eating into the finish or the Cerakote of the slide itself, which means you're having excess drag, which is raising the weight and producing more of a rounded or a rolling effect on your trigger. So what happens if you do have that mark? That means you need to get out the file or the Dremel, probably not the Dremel unless you're really good with using it, and take a little bit off that vertical extension so that there's clearance for that vertical extension to do its job without rubbing on the slide. Like I said, you can check the slide itself, and you can put a flashlight in with your Glock Armor's plate. You should be able to see that also with a flashlight with the Glock Armor's plate in place. That's the next place to make sure that your factory or even your factory trigger or a drop-in trigger doesn't suck. What is the next thing that you want to look at? Okay, the next thing you want to look at is the at the cruciform where it rides on the striker lug. Almost all of your aftermarket triggers, drop-ins, unless it's a custom one, like mine, they put the trigger bar in a tumble polisher so that it's bright and shiny and looks like it's polished. And yes, it's polished, but not polished where it really counts. So this comes with a bit of a caveat. You don't want to remove much in the way of material here. You want to probably not remove any material, but if you're tuning it and we're trying to get the most bang for your buck, polish that. Truly take the time to polish that. Get it looking shiny. I'm not telling you to get out there with a whetstone and turn it into a knife's edge or anything like that. I am telling you to polish it up. Get it nice and clean. Perfection in this area is not going to give you as much benefit as you might think. Polishing really is not as big a benefit as most people are led to believe. The 25-cent polish job or trigger job for a Glock is worth about 25 cents. But you can tune a little bit extra out by polishing that up very nicely. Also, where the vertical extension rides on that safety plunger, that is another place that some polishing can do a good deed. Just saying. Okay, the next point. This one gets into springs, and springs, especially in the gun world, is where you can get yourself into trouble and you can really mess things up. And especially when it comes to striker springs, where you can start to lose function of the gun by light primer strikes. Zev, I think, calls them 2-pound springs. Some of the other places call them 4-pound springs, 4.5-pound springs. Those are competition springs. You're going to see a lot of people use those springs, or they're going to tell you use a 4.5-pound spring. I'm not a huge proponent of the 4.5-pound spring. I do sell them in the competition kits. They are competition springs. If you have good ammo that is going to light off really well, use the 4.5-pound spring or 4-pound spring. But honestly, I find that the lighter the spring, the more disconnected you're actually going to feel on your trigger finger from the action of the gun. With like, for example, the Ghost Equalizer 3.0 and the Peacemaker 3.0, I include a 5-pound spring. He said, James, isn't that what Glock uses, the 5-pound spring? No, it is a 5.5-pound spring. So the 5-pound spring is what I consider the most optimal, and that is where you're going to still get good trigger feel. And I'm going to be rambling because this is live. So here we are learning some secrets. With a heavier weight spring, you are going to feel more of a wall before the break. And you think, well, that's dumb. Of course you are, because it's heavier. Yes. But if you're tuning something for all the way through, you got to look at this as a system. This is an entire system. So what you change here or there can change the way the rest of the trigger feels. So if you're looking for a certain feel, changing different things in the system is going to change the way that the end product feels. That's why just throwing everything at it and then wondering why your trigger feels like a mushy bowl of, Gen Z, that's why, because you've just thrown everything at it. You got to tune the system. And that's why I'm telling you to get the most out of your drop-in system. Even with the drop-in system that you get from me, you need to tune it and you need to look at the entire system. And like I said, I can ramble and I can talk on and on. So I do apologize for this, but I am trying to get to a point or different points. So you're going to get some nuggets of information, and you're probably going to get a lot of stuff that just doesn't matter because I do tend to ramble. So I must apologize for that. Back to springs, striker springs, 5 pounds. That's the one that I consider the magic point to getting a lighter trigger break, but still retaining trigger feel. And going on a tangent, and I apologize for this. A light trigger is less important than a tactile, sure trigger. I have built a lot of triggers and I am not a big fan. I've got 3 different trigger pull gauges and I rarely ever use them. When I first got into guns and building triggers and playing with triggers, I swore by that thing and I wanted it to be exact, and that's not where you're going to get a good trigger. Throw that out the window. Seriously, throw that thing out the window. It's feel. It's not weight, it's feel. What you feel, what your trigger finger is happy with, and what you are able to maintain sight, your sight picture with a good breaking trigger, that is going to be far better than a light trigger that travels for 3 miles before it breaks. Key. And I will stand on that soapbox, and I'm sweating. It's still warm here in Louisiana. I do have my fan on. Again, rant. Apologize, but not the AC. So it's still a bit warm here in the trigger cave. Hopefully, as the weather cools down. Sorry, rant. Okay, trigger feel above trigger weight. Again, that is more important than anything else. So 5 pound striker spring. That is what I consider the optimum striker spring for most setups. 5.5 pound factory from Glock. That's a good setup. And I have told a lot of people to leave that, and they've been very happy. And then we're talking competition shooters that are using a 5.5 pound spring out there, not a 5 pound, not in a 4.5 pound, because the trigger break, the trigger action is superior. And that's what's important. The weight, don't get me wrong, an amazing 2.5 pound or 2 pound trigger that has very little creep, very little additional movement. That's perfect. That is amazing. But you will find that a competent trigger at 5.5 pound or 6 pound or 7 pounds, most oftentimes you're going to be more accurate than some 2 pound or 1 pound trigger that just has no discernible wall, or just breaks when it wants to, when a moth farts on it because it's so light. You're going to get better results from the 7 pound with amazing action than you are the super light one. So I do apologize. That is a tangent. That is something that I will get on that soapbox and I will talk about. Striker springs, let's get back to it. I'll try not to waste too much time, as I already have. 5 pound striker spring, that's the one I find to be supreme. There is a 6 pound, there's even higher rated in Newton meters. And I used those for a while in the original tactical, not the current tactical, but the original tactical. I used I think it's almost a 7 pound trigger spring or striker spring. Uh, kind of a neat situation. Tuning triggers, you can play with those. If you get a chance, buy a range of springs, and I've got a small range on the website, but go to Wolf Springs. They sell good quality ones, or I think Ghost has which is just repackaged Wolf Springs. Play with it. If you're going to tune it, if you want it to be what you want it to be, you got to play with them. You got to tune them. The next thing, the 6 pound or the trigger spring, the return spring, the one that goes on the trigger bar to the housing. For the most part, I leave that as the factory 5 pound spring. 6 pound springs. The one reason why I don't really recommend those is because that spring is pulling against the trigger bar and the striker spring, the striker. Okay. So when you put a 4 pound, well, let's call it a 4 pound, 4.5 pound, or 5 pound springs, do you recommend upgrading triggers in duty guns? Well, that really comes down to the end user. You have to find a trigger that you would rely upon and has a good reputation, and whether or not you can actually upgrade your trigger in the duty gun, and what that gun is being used for. So, okay, so you have a 6 pound spring that's pulling even harder against that trigger bar and that striker lug. Okay, so you got that striker with that, let's call it a 5 pound or a 4 pound. You want the lightest trigger possible, so you include a trigger spring and a light striker spring. They're fighting against each other. Okay, well, while that break may be incredibly light, because that striker has to pull that trigger bar forward for reset. If you have a super heavy trigger spring that's pushing back, and you have a really light striker spring that's pulling forward, that's going to slow your reset down even farther, slow its speed down even farther. And that's one of the reasons why the Timney trigger sucks. I said it. Timney sucks. Timney actually makes an awesome trigger system for rifles. Their Glock trigger system sucks. It sucks in that regard because you've disconnected the striker, which pulls that trigger bar forward, from that. With the Timney system, you remove that, and it relies on an extremely weak trigger spring to pull the trigger forward. Rant time. A lot of people, when they were building P80s, you would see, why does my trigger not work? And I would see it in different groups and whatnot, or they would send me an email after they bought a trigger and they said, I don't understand why my trigger doesn't work. It doesn't reset. It doesn't return forward. And they would send me a video, or I would have to ask, and they didn't have the slide. They didn't have their slide yet, because a Glock uses the striker lug in the slide to pull the trigger bar forward. So you have to have that. So, rant time. I'm sorry. I apologize. With a 6-pound striker spring or trigger spring in there and a lighter striker spring, you then slow down your reset. So, again, with tuning, if you have that 6-pound striker or trigger spring and you have a 4-pound striker spring, you're slowing down. And if you're a competition shooter, you want to shoot fast, you want that reset to be crisp and you want it to be quick. Well, now you've slowed it down. If you've got those two opposing forces, you've lightened the trigger spring and you've lightened the striker spring. Now you've slowed everything down. So if you want a quick reset, I've shot Daniel Horn trigger for Tim. Really not. Oh, okay. Hey, crisp. That's what it's about. You want a good crisp figure. And if I don't know if you heard me ranting about feel overweight. I mean, It's earlier on in the stream. Uh, I've gotten off track. I apologize many times now. If you want to tune for optimal trigger reset speed, not distance, but trigger speed, you want to make sure that your striker spring is not too light and your trigger spring is not too heavy. That's why, for the most part, I like to leave the 5 pound trigger spring in. And then whatever the customer tunes for their striker spring, they're still going to get a fairly good or perfect reset instead of having a 6 pound spring fighting against whatever they put, because striker springs are cheap and people will change those out. And like I said, you can really have a crappy reset. And I am all about trigger action over trigger weight. So having a good crisp reset, quick reset is important to me. So I normally leave a 5 pound spring in there. Gen 5 is the same way. They have a little bit different system, but it works basically the same way. That trigger spring is fighting the or is acting on the trigger bar, which the striker lug is then pushing the opposite way. So again, that's part of the tuning system. So like I said, I don't know what a lot of drop-ins put. I don't know all of what drop-ins put in. A lot of times they'll actually put in either a 6 pound or a 5 pound. Get yourself a couple trigger springs. They're normally about $3. That way you can tune again, that sort of thing. And like I said, that's part of tuning. Figure out which trigger return spring is best for you and make sure that you can tune for that reset, because it really does make a difference. And it's something that is overlooked because people just throw parts. And like I said, drop-ins a lot of times, in order to get that super low 3.5 pound or 3 pound break, they'll throw in the heavier spring. And so you have a mushy or slow reset. And then at the end of the day, that's why your drop-in trigger sucks. It's